ahead and get started. I imagine others will filter in as they fuel up on coffee and other caffeine options for the morning. They're going to need it with the heat in this room, but we're going to make sure the panelists are going to overcome that and really charge up your thinking, I think. So this is a panel about challenges and potential opportunities in building energy infrastructure in North America. So the panelists are going to share their perspectives from across North America, and I'm just going to set the stage for you that the experiences that they're going to share about what's happening today and what they expect in the future are set against a backdrop of what we've seen as increased North American energy market integration and energy abundance over the past decade or so. Our markets have become increasingly interdependent across all sources of energy, really, due to physical infrastructure build out across our borders, as well as free trade treatment up to recent times for many energy commodities. So we have obviously this great geographic proximity with our neighbors that facilitates a degree of market integration. We have electricity infrastructure that extends across the U.S.-Canadian border as well as across the U.S.-Mexico border. We have oil and gas markets that are very strongly linked, not just with pipeline infrastructure and seaborne exports and movements, but we see these markets across the U.S., Canada, and Mexico as being very heavily dependent in the oil and gas space. Something that certainly many people in the public don't comprehend or are familiar with is that Canada is the top destination for U.S. crude oil exports. In 2016, it amounted to 58% of all U.S. crude oil exports, where Mexico was the fourth largest importer of U.S. crude in that year. Canada is also the largest source of U.S. natural gas imports. We get of our U.S. natural gas, U.S. domestic market for natural gas, we import the most from Canada. And Mexico is the largest export destination for U.S. natural gas. What makes these linkages in our markets possible, as you all know, is infrastructure, both cross-border and within these countries, across a full array of energy options. Yes, we have energy abundance, whether it's oil, gas, renewable electricity, efficiency, or other fuels, that has really confounded our expectations over the past decade. But it's the infrastructure that we had available and that we've been able to build that really knits this all together and makes it possible. It turns out that's getting increasingly difficult to do. What is that? Build infrastructure of all sorts. So we're going to have three different perspectives here on experiences with building infrastructure, how that's changing, and some pronouncements about what it holds for the future. And first up, we have Jean-Denis Charlebois, who is from the National Energy Regulator, the newly formulated National Energy Regulator. And he's coming to us from the front lines in Canada of dealing with opposition, seemingly coming from all angles over the past decade, at scale and with persistence to infrastructure build out. This has led to some institutional realignment in Canada from the regulator that Jean-Denis is going to tell us about, and tell us a little bit about the intention behind it, and I think importantly what it may suggest to those of us watching from this side of the border about what's coming our way. So with that, Jean-Denis. Oh, and by the way, I'm Paula Gant with the Gas Technology Institute. I forgot to introduce myself. It's great to be here with you. Let's see. See if I get the right one up there. Over to you. I think it's actually getting hotter in here.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Paula. Yes, I'm Jean-Denis Charlebois from the Canada Energy Regulator. I know some Canadians are in the room, so you will remember the National Energy Board, or the NEB, and the NEB became the Canada Energy Regulator in August 2019, so it's just a couple of months in. And for our friends from the US, our mandate is a combination of the mandate of the FERC, PHMSA, and also the Energy Information Agency. so covering a wide range of energy matters in Canada. And the core of our mandate is that we are a life cycle regulator for pipelines across provincial boundaries and to the United States. So fair to say that there has been no shortage of pipeline drama in North America. Keystone XL, the Trans Mountain expansion, Line 3 from Enbridge, now Line 5, whether it is Indigenous consultation, Indigenous rights, environmental assessments, and also even the economic need of the project have all been at the center of the debate. And that speaks to the challenges of developing energy infrastructure. So this will be essentially the topic of my remarks today. I will walk you through three aspects of the situation. The first one, providing a brief overview of energy in Canada. And then I'll focus in on a very concrete example of what has happened in Canada when there is inadequate pipeline capacity for oil transportation, and conclude on the most recent development regarding the implementation of Bill C-69 regarding a new regulatory framework for such facilities. But first, let's take a quick look at the role of energy in Canada. So we are obviously a resource-rich country from an energy perspective. We are the third largest oil reserves in the world, and also a large supplier of crude oil, natural gas, and hydroelectricity to the United States, relying on both hydrocarbons and also renewable energy, which is quite relevant to point out in this day and age. Also, potentially a future LNG exporter. This is at least what the energy industry is hoping for. And another interesting point to note is that contrasting with what we just heard in the session earlier this morning, the generation capacity in Canada for electricity is more than 80% non-emitting. So it's either from, well, mostly from hydroelectricity, some portion nuclear, but more than 80% is non-emitting. Most of the commodities, whether it's electricity or hydrocarbons destined for trade internationally, flow on facilities that are regulated by the CER, so our organization. And it's important to understand the operational context into which our organization now sits, and kind of created this transition from the National Energy Board to the Canada Energy Regulator. First, the public is more diverse and more interested than ever on energy and environmental issues. So that's one point. The other is that Canada has important potential to continue to increase production of hydrocarbons. But in order for those commodities to reach market at fair market prices, then there needs to be incremental capacity to be put online, and that has created quite a bit of challenges that I'm going to talk about later. And then the third is the drive to meet Canada's commitment regarding climate change. Canada is a signatory of the Paris Agreement, and that is a result, actually, of an important push for the country to reduce its GHG emissions. So let's zoom in on the case around oil production in Western Canada that has unfolded over the last couple of years. The graph shows essentially three main variables. The first one is oil pipeline capacity, which is a shaded area at the back of the lines. And we have the black line that is the oil available for export. And the blue line is the price differential, essentially the differential in price between Canadian oil traded in Hardisty in Alberta and West Texas Intermediate traded at Cushing here in the United States. So what we see is that at the most acute period, essentially almost 1 year to the day in the fall of 2018, is that the black line, so oil available for export, outpaced the pipeline capacity that is available for export, creating a gap which is kind of the white space on the right-hand side, which is essentially 365,000 barrels per day that couldn't find its way on pipelines at the fall of 2018. So what are the impacts? The first one is that it has a big impact on prices for producers in Alberta, is that because they cannot get access to pipeline capacity, then they need to discount their production to be able to clear the market. And then this means, producers cannot get a fair market price for their production. And the situation reached a level so acute in the fall of 2018 that policymakers took two key actions. The first one is that the Federal Minister of Natural Resources, Minister Sohi at the time, asked the NEB to check what could be done to further optimize pipeline capacity that is already in the ground. The second action, which is not probably, but is much more fundamental, is the province of Alberta imposing production limit on crude oil in Alberta. The curtailment started at 325,000 barrels per day in January 2019, January of this year, and has been gradually alleviated through the months as storage is being drawn down because of the lower production level. The most recent announcement occurred last week, providing a special allowance to producers who commit to ship their incremental production by rail. So ultimately, inadequate pipeline capacity has created lower prices, production limits, and that feeds into GDP. The estimate is that between $20 and $80 million per day was lost in the fall of 2018 because of the price discounts. Some of you that are more attuned to the current news will know that the Keystone Pipeline is currently shut down because of a spill in the United States. So that is evidence in the fact that the price differential between WCS and WTI, even though it had recovered quite significantly following curtailment, I hear this morning is at the highest it has been since the fall of 2018 at more than $20. So the focus has been about oil, and the natural gas side has had actually a surprisingly similar story in terms of capacity needing to be developed to reach new supply basin in northeast British Columbia and northwest Alberta, and then we can get into that later if there is interest. But that situation around oil pipeline is essentially the result of 5 major pipeline projects that had been proposed since 2012, but either were canceled or delayed. And the summation of the potential capacity from those projects add up to more than 3 million barrels per day. Obviously, those pipelines will not have been built at the same time, but suffice to say that it's impossible to kind of gloss over the impact that not having those pipelines built have had on the producers in Western Canada. So since 2012 has also been the period where the operational context that I've talked about earlier has been the most acute. Greater public interest, increased desire to build infrastructure to ship incremental production at fair market prices, and also the drive to meet or to reduce GHG emissions. So that takes me to the last slide, which is the most recent structural change that the Canada energy system.
Sorry, that's not.
Thank you for the reminder. I'm on pace. I'm on pace. The most recent structural change, which is the implementation of Bill C-69 and the creation of the Canada Energy Regulator. I mean, a lot has been said about Bill C-69, especially for those of you who are attuned to Canadian politics. But one thing that has been glossed over during the debate is the preamble to the new legislation. Preamble outlining a couple of policy objectives, something that was not in place with the National Energy Board Act that was the predecessor of that piece of legislation. So the policy objectives obviously include reconciliation with Indigenous people, science-based decision-making, safe and secure infrastructure. But what I want to draw your attention to is one policy objective that is on the right side of the slide, which is enhancing Canada's global competitiveness. And from our perspective, that brings a new explicit focus that, coupled with the new governance structure with a board of directors, essentially gives us the space to focus on, okay, what else could be done from a regulatory perspective to increase the competitiveness of the energy system in Canada on a global basis. Ultimately, at least from my perspective, and that's my own interpretation of the situation, is that the goal is the bullet number 4, which is essentially enabling the carrying out of sound projects, or projects that are found to be in the public interest, in order for create job, sure, and also to allow energy producers to reach international markets at fair market prices. So with that, that's it for my remarks, and I'll be happy to take questions afterwards.
Great. Thanks, Jean-Denis. Perfect. Okay, let's see here. Okay, great. So thanks, Jean-Denis. We're going to, I should have said this at the start, we're going to go through all three presentations and then open it up for some extended Q&A. We hope that we're going to have plenty of time to hear from you and what's on your mind and get additional insights from these three panelists. Next up is Luis Serra, who is Executive Director for the Tecnologico, I will not get that wrong, Tecnologico de Monterrey Energy Initiative in Mexico City. In recent years, we have seen Mexico undergo really dramatic transitions in its energy institutions within government and elsewhere. There have been tremendous efforts to modernize the energy sector and promote integration across North America. This had a really positive impact on new investment, and we're seeing some of the benefits of that. However, we've seen a new government come in with different ideas and a less market-oriented approach. And that's sending some signals that have investors sort of raising their eyebrows and wondering what's going to happen next. And this is particularly of concern for those interested in low-carbon transition. So Luis is going to share his perspective on this state of affairs and what are the things we need to be thinking of to make sure we maintain the momentum in North America. Luis?
Morning. Thank you, Paula.
Muchas gracias.
And thank you, Tisha and Jean-Denis. So first of all, let me explain where I come from. Tecnologico Monterrey is largest private university in Mexico. We are spread across 26 different cities. We have 200,000 students in our school, and certainly we are been moving forward towards having a greater impact to Mexico's society by moving forward in the QS rankings. We were 6 years ago 370 place university. We are now close to being a top 100 university in the world. So that's and on another hand, my job at Tech is really not academic. It's rather a very comprehensive job at placing Tec de Monterrey at all fronts of the energy sector. So that clearly reflects on my responsibility as well as being part of the consultant boards of Mexico's government in terms of the development of the national industry of electricity and the national oil and gas industry that are presided by our Secretary of Energy, our Ministry of Energy. So given that, I'm going to share these thoughts. First of all, in terms of competitiveness, Mexico is certainly lagged with respect to our counterparts in North America, where the World Economic Forum Index of Competitiveness report shows us that the U.S. is the number 2 this year, and Canada is the number 15. Mexico is lagging at place number 48. Now, of course, it's not that Mexico has not moved forward. That's what the report expresses, but it's rather that the counterparts are moving faster than what Mexico is doing. And specifically in terms of the infrastructure, we're placed at number 54. If you look into the subcomponents of that pillar, you'll see that electricity quality supply is one of the parts that we are lagging the most. We're placed 81. So with this very brief overview of where we're standing in the region and as a country, let me tell you that 6 years ago, that's what precisely moved the government forward towards implementing an energy reform, which was drastic institutional rearrangement to allow for foreign investment in different segments of the value chain for oil, gas, and electricity sector. And I'm just going to show you very brief here, just two couple of examples that were very successful in terms of investments in the country. One of them, of course, in the oil and gas sector, in the E&P segment of the value chain, we have these tenders, and we have more than 70 firms participating, with more than 20 countries signing over 100 contracts with the Mexican state to actually develop oil and gas fields in Mexico, and that potential that Jean-Denis mentioned in terms of Canada being the third largest producer of oil and gas in the world, well, we all know that we're part of the same geological formation. So basically the idea was that Mexico was at that level, so we needed to untap those resources. So that created $2.5 billion US dollars in investment, and it certainly took the private firms from producing 3,000 barrels per day in just 4 years up to producing about 90,000 barrels per day. But let me go to the other one, which is rather more interesting with the context that is going on right now in Mexico in the electricity sector. We had this long-run tenders called subastas de largo plazo, which were aimed towards creating new capacity for generation of electricity at a cheaper cost, and that could allow the country to actually commit to the Paris Agreement of reducing emissions towards 2030, but also because we have an internal goal of producing electricity from renewable sources of 35% by 2024. So in that respect, these tenders were highly successful, not just because of the wide array of companies that actually participated in it, but actually the prices were smashing low in terms of competitiveness at every part of the world. So we had prices on average for wind and solar around $20 per megawatt hour. So in that respect, what we had was that the biggest utility company in Mexico, the Federal Electricity Commission, was actually buying energy cheaper than anywhere in the world. So that accrued to more or less like $9 billion US dollars in investments. So now this scenario that I'm actually saying to you, the government that has arrived now certainly has created some challenges on its own that we already have in Mexico. Ones that we had before was the social conflicts. I'm just going to mention 3, because if I'm going to mention the challenges in Mexico for the energy sector, I would rather just take the whole day to talk to you, and I won't finish. But let me just go very briefly through 3 of them, and then we can continue in the Q&A section. One of them is related to social conflicts. We are a very diverse country, but it's not just that as Canada is dwelling with this First Nations approach that they have in their country. It's rather that we also have a different system of land tenure. We have the ejidos, the commoners that are spread around the country. So certainly that has complicated matters. And the fact that the environmental impact assessments is not quite aligned with the social impact assessments, and those people are actually very vulnerable, both in social and environmental terms, has certainly complicated matters in approaching these social conflicts in Mexico. And we have certainly not discussing corruption here, but I certainly know that Jean-Denis would know about the ADCOT case with the natural gas pipeline in Mexico that had that major corruption issue that impeded that it could terminate itself. Now, the other 2, I would say, that are more important to me, at least. The energy policy clarity. I'm just going to mention one brief example. As Jean-Denis was saying, they have the problem that they are increasing production and the capacity of the infrastructure is not meeting that demand growth. Hopefully, we could have that problem. It's not like that. We are actually declining in production in oil and gas. And the thing here is that we have 2 options. One, the most cost-effective one in the short term, is that we need to develop our infrastructure system for natural gas to bring gas from the cheapest region in the world, which is Texas. So we need to do that, but the government does not consider, and that, let me tell you that I've heard officials, high-level officials of the government in Mexico saying that infrastructure that has private investment is not considered national infrastructure. So that's tremendous, because then that doesn't allow us to create that. So the other option is then, well, let's not do that. Let's develop our industry. We don't want to go into non-conventional resources. We don't want to go into shale gas, for example. That's something that the President has expressed very clearly, and certainly there are regions in the country that could use that infrastructure and the development of that industry to create this competitiveness. We're not looking into that. And then the other one, and lastly, is continuity. It seems like this administration does not understand how the sector is intertwined with the other productive sectors in the economy. There's certainly no master plan for that. And if you look at the idea of this government, the core of the concepts that this government looks into the energy sector, it has a name, and it has a very clear name. It's called, in Spanish, Program of Oil. It's compiling to the National Development Plan that the President announced when he was actually elected. So it is not surprising all these things that we're having now, they are of course, no surprise for anyone. One example that took place this last week was that the government announced a modification in the rules to provide certificates of clean energy to those that were investing in new generation capacity for the electricity sector coming from clean energies, mainly renewable, solar and wind mainly. So the change is that the idea was that this was a market incentive mechanism that should allow for new investment to be placed into renewable energy for the country, but for any additional generation capacity after 2014. That's no longer happening. I'm going to mention why in the next sections. I hope I would have my music tone as well. I didn't.
Sorry.
Thank you.
There you go. There's your music tone. I know. Sorry to deprive you, Luis. Everybody gets the tone. Tisha, you'll get yours too. Okay. Thank you, Luis. Let's see here. There we go. Excellent. Maybe. Okay. Fantastic. Thanks, gentlemen. And now we're going to hear from Tisha Schuller, who's principal for Adamantine Energy. She has very much frontline experience here in Colorado that she is increasingly bringing to bear with insights around the country and across North America in helping the private sector to a great extent and regulators come together in conversations to understand what is increasingly a polarized landscape around energy infrastructure and project development more generally, and helping us think about how to navigate stakeholder engagement more effectively than in some aspects, than our experience in some aspects of the energy industry. And she has a particularly keen focus on hyperlocal opposition that she's going to talk to us about, as well as helping companies anticipate investor concerns about how they're managing the risks that come out of these hyperlocal opposition efforts. So, Tisha, thank you for making the trip down from Boulder today. She gets the award for the least miles traveled. So, thanks.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here. As Paula mentioned, at Adamantine, we work at the focus of conflict around energy projects. So before I tell you a bunch of things that are going to scare you about the challenges of energy infrastructure in the U.S., I want to say that at my firm, we believe that we're going to need oil and gas for a long time. And there's a lot of reasons we're going to need oil and gas for a long time. So this perspective isn't driven out of a desire to see the end of oil and gas or the end of energy infrastructure. It's because we believe that for energy to fulfill its purpose, it has to understand social risk. And in this context, social risk is regulatory, political, policy, and community risk. And if we don't understand it, then we're going to continue to see the kind of challenges to very pragmatic, needed infrastructure development that both Jean-Denis and Luis have mentioned are happening in their countries, and we certainly know are happening here in the U.S. So this idea of opposition to infrastructure is true across all types of energy. In fact, you may know that 100% of wind projects in the U.S. are now protested locally, regardless of local politics. So this is just a phenomenon that we're going to see across. And I'm just going to give you a taste of 4 types of opposition happening in the U.S. So it's going to be a little bit of a downer, but don't worry, lunch is after this, and the whole Q&A is when we tell you the uplifting part. So you'll want to stay tuned. So these are things that may or may not be on your radar. So the first one I want to mention is shareholder resolutions. So this is focused on U.S. companies, but as you know, publicly traded companies. It used to be that the investors could get together and put forward a resolution generally focused on price, the value of the share price, or cutting costs, but increasingly lately, there have been shareholder resolutions focused on environmental matters. You do not have to be able to read the details of this unless you need to get get up and stretch your legs, in which case come on up and you still won't be able to see it. But what you have on the left is in the last 10 years, these are just environmental resolutions specifically on oil and gas companies in the U.S., and on the right half is the number of each resolution. So you can see the top few, for example, the top one in the last 10 years, more than 50 resolutions to oil and gas companies on running a 2-degree Paris scenario for many reasons, for identifying stranded assets, for identifying what their emissions portfolios could be. So these resolutions were irrelevant in 2014 because they would get about 20% of the vote. But by 2017, they started passing, and Occidental and Exxon and Anadarko all had 2-degree scenario shareholder resolutions pass. And now you continue to see a rise, but you don't see votes because companies are going into direct negotiations with the people bringing forward the resolutions. So that's a new area. A really, really, really new area from the summer is Bloomberg Philanthropies putting forth what is essentially the largest of, there's a number of efforts in this vein, but Bloomberg Philanthropies invested $500 million in this idea of beyond carbon. So they describe it as the largest coordinated campaign to tackle climate change ever undertaken in the U.S., and there's a number of things that you would expect that they're focusing on, but the thing that caught my attention was preventing a rush to increased reliance on oil or gas anywhere in the economy. So this has very significant ramifications for opposing every oil and gas project pretty much happening anywhere. Earth Justice has their own 0 to 100 campaign, and among their enumerated priorities, one is stopping the rush to gas. So the idea of a bridge fuel, for example, is being directly challenged with literally hundreds of millions of dollars. So the third area is what I like to call aspirational regulation. So in this room, you probably remember in the fall of last year when California, which is, of course, the world's 5th largest economy, made a pledge by executive order to decarbonize their economy by 2045. And most notably, they didn't have a pathway to get there. So it's not actually technically feasible, but we're going to do it by 2045. Personally, I didn't take it seriously. I should have. Since then, 5 states, including the one you're sitting in right now, have passed similar regulation, and the most notable is New York's. And the reason that New York, I'm jumping ahead. The reason that New York's is most important is because not only do they have the most ambitious reduction targets, but the Act specifies that every state agency take these climate goals into consideration in all permitting decisions. So now even things like pipe replacement of gas infrastructure for safety is going to be starting to go through a climate screen. So then the last thing which Paula mentioned that I'll run through is hyperlocal. This is really relevant, of course, for all linear infrastructure, where, as you know, a pipeline from western Colorado trying to get to the West Coast for LNG exports now has to go through over 300 jurisdictions, any one of which, if 10 moms show up with their babies or 15 college students in their pajamas, they can essentially stop these major infrastructure projects. Very, very effective. And then one last thing that you might not know, but there are 2 movies this year describing invasions of zombies caused by fracking. So whether this is actually a physical threat or simply a symbolic threat, we don't know yet, but it's something you should keep an eye on. And because Daniel Ramey is the one, you should wave your hand, who actually found these fracking zombies. I think he should be the official zombie hunter of USAEE. What do you guys think? Yeah. So somebody put a motion forward somewhere for that to happen. Okay, so the last thing I'll say about this to tee up our Q&A is that I just gave 4 of what I could have given a dozen of really big, potentially existential risks to energy infrastructure as we know it. But we could look at it as the kind of risk that we mount a war against, right? We know what that looks like. The oil and gas industry knows what that looks like. Or we could think of it as an opportunity, and an opportunity to fill the void of leadership that the world is truly looking for in an era where people want to see decarbonization at scale with players that can invest billions of dollars and happen to have infrastructure all over the world. So I think there's a real leadership opportunity here for the existing energy players, and in my case, particularly the oil and gas industry. So I will be happy as we have our Q&A, I will refer back to this paradigm as a switch I think we need to make in the face of this kind of social risk. So with that, I will turn it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tisha. Okay, I'm scared.
I'm going to clear this or just leave it?
Well, the adventure begins. Let's go there. I have a couple of questions, of course, moderator's prerogative for the panel, and then I'd ask folks to start queuing up, and I can imagine there are other questions among this room. So the first question I have is for Jean-Denis and Luis. So, and there's Tisha's time. So she was super efficient.
I have a lot more.
Of course, I don't know how to operate this. So, Jean-Denis, you talked about global competitiveness for Canada and how that's front of mind for the new regulator, the Canadian Energy Regulator. So could you talk to us a little bit about what you mean, what's some concrete actions that you'll have taken with that competitiveness piece in mind? And beyond, and you mentioned, I'll note, global competitive, not just looking at North America. And particularly, what do you mean by a modern governance structure? And then, Luis, you talked about competitiveness as well. And I'm wondering if you could talk to us about some specific aspects of modernization of institutions that you are most concerned with preserving or strengthening as we move into this next phase of transition. What do you think that has been started is like really on your mind as we need to focus attention on maintaining that momentum? Jean-Denis?
Thank you. So starting on competitiveness, the NEB was not talking about competitiveness explicitly, but when we noticed the preamble, we realized that we were already doing a couple of things that were aligned with competitiveness. And one was basically using a risk-based approach. Thank you. A risk-based approach to facilities assessment. So what does that mean? So it means that for the small-scale projects, we can streamline the assessment of this and provide certainty to industry in a timely manner. And now, given all the discussion about digitalization and greater reliance of data, we have a group at the CER that focuses on that, and we are starting to lean on automation in order to basically run some of the steps internally to be even more efficient. A risk-based approach, the flip side of this is for the bigger, more important, more significant projects. We have developed a greater focus around reconciliation with Indigenous people and also greater engagement with local communities. So it sounds natural somehow, at least to me, to say that, but there was a conscious decision made in the past that we would not actually try to ram an assessment process too quickly if the public interest demands something more comprehensive. And ultimately, the goal is to make sure that we hear from communities, that we address the Indigenous rights the best we can, so that ultimately our process will withstand legal challenges. And if our processes do that, then it provides a necessary certainty for investors to run through the development process of a project. The second piece is that there has been this maybe ambiguity around, okay, what is the threshold to have a pipeline approved in Canada? What is the information that the regulator or government requires before making a decision whether it's in the public interest or not? The new legislation actually lists 12 factors that need to be considered. The previous one had 5, now we have 12. So I think it provides more clarity to all stakeholders, proponents in terms of what to be prepared for, local stakeholders, okay, these are the things that the regulator will need to consider. And one piece that is quite remarkable actually is that one of those factors is the extent to which the project will either hinder or contribute to Canada's ability to meet its climate goals. So I know that there has been parties that disputed whether it's relevant or not, but the fact of the matter is that in this day and age, there needs to be a recognition of the social context into which infrastructure gets developed. And if we avoid that climate change question, then we undermine the credibility of the process that we're running. So now with having the clarity about criteria, then we think that it will be more meaningful in terms of assessment process, and also better or more robust to withstand legal challenges. And then to your question about what does it mean to have a modern governance structure, two key attributes. The first one is that the CER now has a board of directors. And that board of directors is essentially an agent of the minister in front of the, not in front, but an agent of the minister for the regulator in order to make sure and hold us to account as to whether or not strategically we are going in the right direction. So that's one. And the second piece is a clearer separation of the adjudication activities, so essentially the review processes that we run of pipelines, and a clearer separation between the adjudicators and also the staff organization that is running all of the engagement and the reconciliation activities, if I can say that, with Indigenous people in order to preserve, again, the robustness of the assessment process.
Thanks, Jean-Denis. Oui?
Well, I would say that the problem here in Mexico in terms of preserving these institutions that we've created over the past years, specifically with this energy reform process, is the fact that behind the idea of competitiveness lies the concept of efficiency. And for this government, efficiency or cost-effective or the economics of are not relevant at all. And the problem is that probably you guys here in the U.S. and Canada, you might have administrations that might propose certain ideas that might seem not so very focused, but the good thing about your governments is that you've created institutions for so long that you have checks and balances. That's something that Mexico struggled very hard to attain, and because it doesn't have this long experience with these checks and balances, it's now starting to fire back at them. So for example, if you think of it, this new government has pretty much now captured the Supreme Court of Justice in Mexico. Now all ministers are very close to the president, or at least majority of them. You have the same thing with the institution that actually evaluates social programs in the country. You have that with the energy regulators, both the similar to the regulator for the electricity of oil and gas, which is the Energy Regulatory Commission, CRE, and now they're coming after the CNH, which is the oil and gas regulator. They're actually placing people that are close to the government, that were former officials of the Ministry of Energy or former directors at the National Oil Company, Pemex. And the idea is that these regulators are not longer going to be independent. They're actually going to follow the instructions of the factotum of the sector, which is the Ministry of Energy. Now, on the other hand, we're going to have those same captures in another very strong checks and balances that we have. One of them is, for example, and I'm very troubled about that because we have probably one of the best geostatistics institutes all over the world, which is the INEGI, and which is led by a former colleague of Sean, former ITAM professor Julio Santella. And the problem here is that the concept of economic growth is not close to the administration perception of the world. So basically what they're going to change and to modify is the idea of growth. So I'm going to give two examples of how this is actually developing in the country right now. We have the refinery, for example. So there's this study by the Institute of Mexico's Competitiveness, IMCO, which is a think tank. And this study basically shows that in a very simple model, they show that only in 2% of cases would the refinery be probably a good idea for the government, right? So, but basically everyone is telling the administration, well, why don't you just import fuels from the most cost-effective way from you have your neighbor right across the country, you develop infrastructure, you bring in the short term, and then in the long run you might have another plans. But this government has repeatedly say it's not about economics, we don't care about that, it's just about the sovereignty of the country. And that's a problem because as you probably are aware, early this year we have a major problem of shortage that the government tried to cover by saying that they were pursuing the oil and gas thieves, right? The huachicoleros, they were going after them, so that's why mainly explains that we didn't have fuel in our country. But the reality is that there's a misplacement of the needs of the country, of the energy system, and the policy that it's pursuing. Another example of that is Pemex itself. This government has a very strong commitment towards sovereignty, that actually it says that the national company has to be the cornerstone of the economy. Are you talking about the same company that has the same amount of utilities that Saudi Aramco has in 1 year, but in debt? In total debt, that's over $100 billion. So what they do not realize is that this risk is so huge that it's going to somewhat extend towards Mexico's economy. And that is where my opportunity, and to be honest, and probably it's a very sad commentary for me, a very sad comment for me to say, but that's where I think it's an opportunity to turn around things. Once they do realize this has true impacts in the rest of the economy, is when they probably might check reality, touch the floor, and say, well, this is no longer going to hold up.
Thanks, Luis. And that's a really great segue to my question for Tisha. It's like, in this terror, there is opportunity. Tisha referred to the Beyond Carbon initiative that was launched quite spectacularly this past year, with it explicitly framed a moves beyond oil and gas. There's tension, obviously, Tisha, between that and your viewpoint, which I share as well, that we're going to need oil and gas well beyond mid-century. And you mentioned that in this opposition, there's an opportunity. So in this challenge, as Luis noted, there's an opportunity. We can take it as an opportunity or a threat. How do we embrace that opportunity and avoid gearing up for trench warfare to avoid the zombie apocalypse?
So I'll build off of something that Jean-Denis just said, which is that we have to look at this in the social context. And the polarization of politics has made it really easy to have climate be one group's issue and not worrying about climate being another. And this is U.S.-centric, but it certainly holds true in many ways in Canada as well. And when in that context, then these risks are irrelevant. But my perspective is now that the risks are so relevant that there's an opportunity. I'll speak specifically to the oil and gas industry. For the industry to ask, what is the public looking for? What do they want in their concern about climate and this drive for decarbonization? And I think for a little while, people were looking at wind and solar and saying, that's the answer. And pretty recently, people have gone, it's not enough. It's too small, it's too fragmented, it's too dispersed, and it only takes care of a fraction of the concern about carbon emissions. So that's the opportunity, I think, is for leadership. The oil and gas industry is an example of